Okay, I think I'm on. Good. Yeah, it's nearly lunchtime, don't worry, we'll get there. So I couldn't really honestly have asked for a better keynote this morning. I wasn't expecting that one, but it came up pretty nicely. I think what we're looking at here, whenever we talk about big data, we talk about IoT, we talk about fintech, all of the things that were in the program for the conference coming up. All of those come down to these big system effects, and all of those big systems eventually have parts that fight with each other, parts that have conflicting interests, and that's pretty much what my talk was about, so thanks very much, organizers. But in particular, what I want to talk about is this, this issue of the commons, right? So some of you will know the tragedy of the commons, some of you won't. It's a very old idea that, clearly there are some common goods, there are some things that people can use, they might be able to use them for free, they might be able to use them for a fee, but they're definitely shared in some way. And what happened with the old cows, for example, is that when you had common land in England, a farmer who wanted to maximize either their yield or their personal livestock things, whatever else, they could graze their animals on the common land, and that gave them basically free food, it gave them free space. And some people might notice that if you put too many sheep, for example, eat more grass and destroy more area than cows do. They just happen to behave that way. And so if you put the cows on there and the sheep on there, the sheep would sort of take away the food for the cows. And some people might be conscientious and think, this is a bad idea. I'll only take my own little portion of the space. I'll be responsible. But what would generally happen if somebody was responsible is that somebody else wouldn't be, and they'd take up the space and they would maximize their profits while polluting in the modern sense, but just taking up the land, taking up the grass, destroying the common fields. And what this has to do with data is that we have a very similar situation coming on right now. We've got a situation where we have, compared to when I started in this thing, we've got infinite free bandwidth now, except Twitter's down, so that's a problem. But we have so much communications capability that people don't really pay for in a direct sense. In terms of you don't pay you don't pay the equivalent amount to download a YouTube movie as you do for other things. You have a static fee, the pipe's there, and if you want to exploit the data, the bandwidth, you can do that. So what we had in the program, we've got this idea of the data native, the digital native, and things. This is what I want to concentrate on here. Data, for people who are not digital natives and data natives, computers and machines and technology and information and data, these all seem like very strange concepts. It's stuff that people can't get their head around. It's invisible in a sense. But it really isn't. When we get into big data and IoT, when we get into the payment systems and the financial services, what that data represents is real life. What that represents is a thing that is happening that can either make your life better, or it can make your life worse, or it can affect society in some way. It's a real thing. The same thing with the IoT. So at the moment, we think of IoT, we had it in the keynote again, we think of IoT as the light bulb. So it's the color changing stuff, it's the toaster that tweets when the toast is done, it's the blinds that open and close, and the Nest thermostat and things. And I'm not knocking those, I have all of those things in my house. Before Twitter went down, I even said so. Right, so I have the cooker that you can set, and you can do it remotely over the internet from work. It'll cook my meat over a period of however many hours at exactly the right temperature. It's connected to the things I have in my house that do my climate control and turn on the dehumidifier at the right minute. Those things exist, and they're very cool, and I like them, but that's not really what I'm talking about. When we say with a huge opportunity in IoT, really where we're going is, I'm going to skip those for a second, is here with big systems interconnected, not my house. Who cares? If my meat overcooks a little bit, it doesn't matter. If I have purple lights instead of green lights when I'm in my hot tub at night, does that matter? Not so much. But if we're coming to a world where we can integrate transport networks and power networks and civic services like street lighting, so that when you've got this sports stadium here, and on a day when it's full, you can turn on the lights at extra times, you can move the electricity demand around, you can do better things automatically with the load demand on the local transport, That's an excellent thing to do, but it's also something that could go very badly wrong if you don't do it right. So coming back to this opportunity, yes, there's a huge opportunity, but you've got to be responsible. And I think what we've been seeing in the past is that people don't necessarily get these things right, for a variety of reasons. Some people do, of course, but you've got the accidental failures where people are just so taken with the opportunity, this idea that I can do a thing, so I will do a thing. I will automate my street lighting. And they get carried away and they see that and they do it, and people don't really spot that it's wrong until it's gone wrong. But then even worse than that, we have this things that are going deliberately wrong, where the interests of what people are trying to do are not necessarily in your own interests. And what we see, the rogue ad networks in mobile, again, it's a bad example because it doesn't matter so much. But it's a harbinger of what's to come. You can only imagine that there will be other people's interests also inside your home when it comes to integrated communications and home hubs and smart energy. The other nice example I like to use for conflicts of interest in this space is in smart energy, because smart energy grids are happening. They're happening slower than people might like to think. But there's this very controversial idea that in order to make up for local capacity demand and fluctuations and things, let's say, so everybody by 2020 is going to have an electric car, and they're going to plug that electric car in at night. And if you are sort of charging your car up and it's 3 a.m. and there's suddenly a load demand in the next door house, they might want to drain a little bit of your power out of your car battery rather than firing up another turbine or something to supply the energy across. And they're hoping that you don't have an emergency and you don't need your vehicle until 6 a.m. and you'll be able to charge it back up again on the normal drain. Those kinds of ideas are going to get very, very pervasive. And what you'll find is that the things you think you own, you don't own. The stuff you think you control, you don't control. And worse still, it doesn't take very long before nobody controls it, because so many different interests are in there and the code is so complicated and so many people like me have turned this stuff off. Because yes, I have all those toys in my house, but they're behind a VPN and they're behind another router that's plugged into my router, so the internet features don't work unless you have my VPN keys, but those guys weren't expecting that, right? All of these hacks will grow and grow, and nobody will really be able to predict what's going on if you don't think about the system as a whole and work together in the system as a whole. Interesting thing with motivations on that is that we've heard, I think, half the talk so far today have talked about we're generating loads of data, we want to have as much data as possible, and then as soon as we've got it, we want to share it. And yes, that's true. Again, when we get into this world of the integrated city, the smart cities, all of the other things, we have to share the data. It's impossible to coordinate if you don't share the data, but the problem with that then is that any place where the data exists, you've got a new security risk, and no matter how careful the stadium guys are, for example, and no matter how bulletproof their security is, the second the control data or the monitoring data goes out to somebody else, it's at risk again. And this is where the point I wanted to make earlier on about data being real is so important, because as soon as you've done that, you haven't just lost sort of a data breach. Again, it's a kind of trivial example. It's only money here. But you've actually put out an opportunity for somebody else to lose control of your energy network, potentially, or your transport network. And that becomes a very human problem. Very interesting thing, I don't think I put it up here, but because of that very fact, people are starting to wake up to this. Because the banks were careful and the account holders and shoppers were careful, they kept their computers kind of safe and they kept their cards kind of safe. There's actually a class action lawsuit being arranged on the back of this one to get the losses back, because people have decided that it's not reasonable anymore to play with other people's risk. And so some people are starting to wake up to this, like the famous Ross Anderson, for example, and the banks and the class action lawsuits. If you don't know who Ross is, he's a professor at Cambridge University Computer Lab, and fairly into his security stuff. And what he's seeing is like the point I made earlier on, that your devices, it's just fallen off the screen there, but your devices will become less loyal. The things that you've bought will not be acting in your interest. They'll be acting in some systemic interest, but you may not know what it is. And indeed, you may find that some of them are actually exploitative, which is, again, I don't like to say any technology is good or bad, but people will use it for what they want to use it for. And I think it's not always clear if these things are described to you as a consumer when you pick them up. So I'm going to run on because we don't have too much time, but I think the other point I wanted to make on top of this, that the data is real, it's a human issue, is this emergent issue with big data stuff. So we all know about the privacy issues. They are important, but they to some degree they're being concentrated on. The place where the commons really comes in, with people running fast, making their own gains, but maybe not paying back or taking account or designing for the society as a whole, are some of these things like open source, when we've seen everybody was using OpenSSL, and then we had Heartbleed, and all of a sudden, Tim's back on a plane from Australia because he's the guy who wrote the stuff 20 years ago, and none of these huge businesses who were using it at first wanted to actually pay to invest to fix it, to make this stuff all work. That's going to be an even bigger issue. We're seeing so much open source at this conference, and I suspect the people actually here are community members and are contributing, but I bet if you scale that out to the people who are making use of it, there's not a proportional thing. But the really big issue is this issue of the computer says no. What happens when you automate the road network and you know what to do, but the road network chooses something different, or the power, or your job applications, or your social security, which is based on some invalid analysis of your power consumption data. These things are going to become very, very dangerous human problems if we're not careful. And that's what happens, right? So what can we do about this? Again, the most important point, I think, is that we've got a mishmash of systems right now, and the real world is an old world. The real opportunity that we have in the connected world with big data, with the algorithms that we have, with the computing power that we have now, I really like the city picture. The idea of having a smart city of integrated power and transport and assisted living for less able people. All of these things are such a great opportunity that could make your life so much better. But it has to work in an old context. It still has to work with infrastructure that's very, very old, with technology and a workforce which is not data native. And so what I would like people to do here, philosophically, is to think whenever you're going after an opportunity and you see some great thing that you can do and you see some cool feature that can go in, you find some data in the data lake that you really want to exploit. Think about whether your product and your opportunity is paying its fair share back into society and is not making use of something where somebody else is going to end up paying the cost. And that's the thing. So, what was the other? Yes, the only other thing I wanted to do was the resiliency in algorithms and things. The computer says no, I think, is a really big issue. Single source, vertical siloed stuff is a big issue. And so any opportunity that people have to either work together, work on open standards, or work with products that demonstrate how they work and not just that they work is all going to be really important to making a reliable, connected future. And there's the obligatory end.